In 1853, 94 men stood in a shipyard on the Kennebec River in Bath, Maine, staring at a keel that stretched longer than a football field. 11 months later, they launched the largest wooden ship ever built in America, the Great Republic. 325 feet bow to stern, a beam 53 feet wide, over 2,500 tons of displacement, and not a single power tool touched her. No engines, no hydraulics, no electricity, just axes, hand augers, and men who understood wood the way a surgeon understands the body. So here's the question almost nobody asks. How do you build something that big, strong enough to survive the open Atlantic, using nothing but hand tools? I went looking for the answer in places most people never think to check. Shipyard payroll ledgers, insurance surveys filed with Lloyd's of London, and coroner's records from Sagadahoc County, Maine. Your shipbuilding killed more men than any other trade for 4 decades straight. And what struck me wasn't just the engineering, it's the silence around it. Everyone knows somebody whose grandfather was a carpenter. Almost nobody remembers a shipwright. The skills disappeared. The yards shut down. The men who carried this knowledge in their hands died, and almost none of it was ever written down. Here's what you need to understand before any of this makes sense. In the 19th century, a large wooden ship was the single most complex structure human beings knew how to build. More complex than a house, more complex than a bridge. Because unlike a house or a bridge, a ship had to move. It had to flex. A 300-foot hull working through a North Atlantic storm could bend as much as 6 inches along its length. Build the joints too rigid, and the hull cracks apart. Build them too loose, and she leaks and sinks. The shipwright's entire job was finding the narrow space between those two failures, with an axe, a mallet, and decades of instinct. It all started with the keel, the spine of the ship. On a large vessel, that's a single straight timber running up to 220 feet. No tree grows that long, so shipwrights joined several pieces of white oak using something called a scarf joint, a long diagonal cut, shaved flat by hand with an adze, an axe-like tool with the blade turned sideways. A skilled worker could get that surface flat to within a 1/16 of an inch. The two faces were coated in red lead paste, clamped together, and bolted through holes bored entirely by hand.
From that keel grew the ribs, the frames, each one a curved timber matching the exact shape of the hull at that point. A 300-foot ship needed over 150 of them, built up from shorter curved sections called futtocks. And here's the part that sounds almost unbelievable. Those curves weren't bent into shape. They were found. Men called hewers walked the forests of Maine, Massachusetts, and the Carolinas, searching for trees that had already grown with the right bend. An oak leaning into a hillside, a branch splitting off at exactly the angle they needed. They read timber the way a sculptor reads a block of stone, looking for the shape already hidden inside it. Then came the planking, the most brutal physical labor in the yard. Each plank was a slab of wood up to 40 feet long and 6 inches thick, and it had to curve to match the hull. Workers steamed it inside a long wooden box until the fibers softened. Then a crew of 6 to 8 men wrestled it, still scorching hot, onto the frame using ropes, block and tackle, and iron clamps. They had about 15 minutes before the wood cooled and hardened in the wrong shape. Miss that window, and the whole plank went back in the steam box. Every plank was pinned in place with tree nails, wooden pegs hand-turned on a lathe and hammered home with a 12-pound mallet. A single ship could take more than 30,000 of them, each one driven by a man swinging that mallet thousands of times a day, 6 days a week for months. Then the seams had to be sealed, plank by plank, using a technique called caulking, driving tarred hemp fiber into every gap with a flat iron chisel and a mallet. A good caulker could seal 60 feet of seam an hour, crawling along the hull on his hands and knees. A 300-foot ship had more than 5 miles of seams to fill. There was no measurement, no gauge for how hard to strike, just the feel in a man's wrist, learned over years, telling him the difference between a joint that would hold
and one that would split.
If this kind of forgotten history is worth your time, subscribing is the easiest way to keep it showing up for you. Now, the numbers. 94 men, 11 months, 325 feet. They don't tell you what it actually cost. Buried in a probate filing from Sagatucket County, cross-referenced against a payroll ledger from a Bath shipyard, is the name James Cormier. 28 years old, born just across the border in New Brunswick, working in the Bath yards as a planker, earning $1.75 a day. He had a wife, a young son, and a reputation. Steady, strong, good with steam plank. On the morning of March 12, 1859, Cormier was part of a crew forcing a freshly steamed oak plank into place on a 240-foot ship under construction. The block and tackle holding it slipped. The plank, still hot, still partially bent, swung loose and struck him across the chest, pinning him against a frame timber. He died in the yard 20 minutes later. The company paid his widow his final wages, $8.75, and covered his burial. His son went into the same yards at 14 and spent 31 years working as a caulker.
Cormier wasn't an exception. He was the rule. Falling timber, men crushed between heavy beams, workers falling from scaffolding 30 and 40 feet up with no safety lines, no protective gear, no regulation of any kind. Historical records suggest Bath shipyards alone saw 15 to 25 deaths every decade through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and that number is almost certainly low, since many workers were seasonal laborers from Canada whose deaths were never fully recorded.
Once a hull was built and sealed, it needed masts, and the main mast of a large sailing ship could rise nearly 200 feet above the deck. No single tree could do that job, so shipwrights built masts up from multiple timbers, squared, bound together with iron hoops. Raising one of these, several tons of wood, nearly 200 feet tall, took a rigged A-frame of heavy poles called shear legs and dozens of men hauling on ropes, inch by inch. If a rope failed or a leg slipped, that mast came down on whoever stood beneath it. The era ended, not because shipbuilders lost their skill, but because the world moved past them. By the 1870s, iron-hulled steamships were faster, stronger, and cheaper to insure. Lloyd's of London started charging steep premiums on wooden hulls over 250 feet, effectively pricing the biggest wooden ships out of existence. The last of the great ones, massive, six-masted schooners built in Maine between 1900 and 1909, were already relics the moment they launched. The Wyoming, at 450 feet, the longest wooden schooner ever built, flexed so badly in rough seas, her crew had to run the pumps constantly just to stay afloat. She sank in 1924, taking everyone aboard down with her. Most of those shipyards are gone now. Bath Iron Works still operates on the same river, but it builds steel warships, not wooden schooners. The tools, the adzes, the augers, the caulking irons, the mallets sit behind glass in maritime museums in Maine, and most people who walk past them have no idea what they're looking at. But for 200 years, from the late 1600s to the 1880s, those tools built every ship that carried American trade across every ocean on Earth. Every joint was a judgment call made by a man who understood exactly what the sea would do to his work. Every plank was bent by a crew with 15 minutes to get it right, and almost none of the men who built these ships ever wrote down what they knew. They just built the next one, and the next, until the industry itself disappeared. The ships are gone. Most of them are at the bottom of the ocean. But for 2 centuries, they were the most complex machines human hands ever built, entirely by hand, entirely by feel. One plank, one nail, one man at a time.